Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself drifting through the infinite void. No sun, no moon, no star bright enough to guide the way. Only silence, deep and dense as the universe's own memory. Then, somewhere within that darkness, a faint spark flickers. It trembles like the first breath of a living being. That spark is Earth, a blue speck of dust born amid the fires of the early cosmos. Back then, no one called it a planet. No one called it home. It was merely a spinning mass of stone, filled with rage, rivers of molten lava, oceans that had never known peace. But across billions of years, that stone learned how to dream. It learned to cool so that water could gather. It learned to breathe so that air could wrap around it. And in one incomprehensible instant of destiny, from lifeless molecules, life began to sing its first song. From that moment on, Earth became the greatest living being we know. It isn't merely the ground beneath our feet, it is a colossal body. One that sheds its skin, that aches, that falls silent. Every layer of rock is a memory, every river a vein, every gust of wind the breath of an age long gone. It has died and been reborn countless times. It has burned, frozen, and witnessed entire species rise, reign, and vanish without a trace. The memory of Earth is not written in words, but in ashes, in fossils, in the cracking sound of time itself. It is the diary of a creature that needs no reader, only to exist and to remember. And I often wonder, if Earth could remember, what would it tell us? Would it speak of the winters that lasted centuries, of eruptions that dimmed the sky, of that one moment when only a few hundred trembling humans remained, the last fragile seeds of humankind's memory? Perhaps the planet's voice would be low, slow, but deep as the ocean floor, where all sounds dissolve into whispers. And as I tell this story, I find myself wondering, where are you listening from? And what time is it, where you are? Strange, isn't it? We're speaking of epochs long past, when humankind was still just dust, blown by wind and ice, and yet here we are, you and I, sharing this fleeting, delicate moment in the river of time. Whether you're sitting in the night or under daylight, I'm truly glad you're here. If you enjoy stories like this, slow, quiet ones that hum beneath the surface, echoes of Earth's own memory, you can leave a small sign, a like, a subscription, or simply a gaze that lingers a little longer. No pressure at all, just an invitation, light as mist. Because who knows, when you return next time, perhaps Earth will tell us the next chapter of those frozen days when the whole world seemed to stop breathing. There is something strange, something most of us forget. This planet also knows how to breathe. Not with lungs, but with grand, cosmic rhythms, the vast inhalations and exhalations of ice and snow. Each time it breathes in, the world draws itself inward, wrapped in a silence of white. Each time it exhales, the seas rise, the forests return, and life blossoms as though the planet has just awakened from a long sleep. Looking back at the previous part, where Earth was seen as a being with memory, pain, and rebirth, we can now feel more clearly. Every upheaval, no matter how violent, is merely one heartbeat in the great living flow of the planet. If part 1 was Earth's first breath, then this is the first heartbeat humanity ever learned to listen to. Imagine drifting above an ancient sea, where sunlight filters weakly through a cocoon of dense clouds. There are no birds, no falling leaves, only a slow, tightening chill enclosing the world. And in that stillness, something is happening, so slowly no one could notice, yet so vast it will define the entire history of Earth. This is the first ice age, the deep pulse of nature itself, guided by what humanity would later call the Milankovitch cycles. From afar, Earth seems to orbit the sun in a perfect circle, but in truth, it never does. It wobbles, tilts, and sometimes leans to one side, like a weary dancer who keeps on spinning. And it is precisely these subtle, delicate motions that began the rhythm of the ice ages, each lasting hundreds of thousands of years. The first to perceive this was Milutin Milankovitch, a Serbian mathematician in the early 20th century. In a narrow room filled with celestial maps, he didn't just calculate Earth's orbit, he listened to the hidden beat within it. Milankovitch identified 3 essential motions: eccentricity, the orbit's shape shifting from nearly circular to elliptical, altering Earth's distance from the sun; obliquity, the tilt of Earth's axis wobbling over time, changing how sunlight falls across latitudes; precession, the slow wobble of Earth's spin like a top nearing rest, causing the seasons to drift across millennia. These three motions layered upon one another like chords in an ancient symphony, slow, steady, and powerful enough to freeze or melt entire worlds. When the cycles align just so, the sun's light weakens over the northern hemisphere. Winter snow fails to melt in summer. Each year, the layer thickens, snow becomes ice, and glaciers begin to crawl southward like a silent ocean of cold. That is the moment the planet inhales, deeply. As the endless winter settles, life retreats. Trees shed their leaves, animals migrate, the seas fall more than 100 meters as water becomes locked in colossal sheets of ice. What we now call coastlines were once grasslands, wind-swept plains stretching for miles without obstruction. They had names: Beringia, Doggerland, Sunda, lands that once bridged the continents. Over the last 2 million years, our planet has endured at least 5 major ice ages, each a contraction of the Earth's living breath. When the ice descends, sound itself seems to vanish. Mountains disappear beneath kilometers of frozen white. The sea retreats, reflecting pale sunlight like liquid silver. The entire planet falls into hush, and the only sound left is the slow, brittle heartbeat of the ice. It's hard to imagine, but in those moments, Earth was not dying. It was sleeping, adjusting its internal rhythm, seeking balance again. An ice age is not punishment. It is recovery. When the planet inhales, it gathers energy, slows its pulse, and prepares for the next exhalation. When glaciers melt, forests rise, and new creatures are born. Then, the orbit tilts once more. Sunlight strengthens, warmth returns. The ice retreats, carving deep U-shaped valleys, the fingerprints of glaciers pressed into stone. New plains emerge, blanketed in fine dust ground from mountains by the ice. When grass takes root, the soil becomes strangely fertile. From these thawed lands, life explodes anew. Each cycle of freeze and thaw leaves an imprint in the planet's memory, in layers of sediment, in tree rings, in fossilized pollen. They are Earth's recordings of breath. If we could press an ear to the ground, we might hear the planet's heart, beating slowly through millions of years. Tick, freeze, tick, thaw. No creature escapes this rhythm, not even us. When the glaciers advanced, our ancestors withdrew to warmer refuges: Africa, the Middle East, the coastal valleys. And when the planet exhaled, they pushed forward again, following herds and rivers of melting ice. The first human migrations were guided not by choice, but by the breath of the Earth itself. Our evolution was never a separate story. It was a dance between humanity and the planet. Every step we took, every idea, every invention, happened in the brief pause between the planet's inhale and exhale. From space, Earth appears hauntingly still. The poles gleam beneath the cold sun. Clouds spiral like ribbons of white around a turning sphere. There is no sound, no hint of war, no sign of civilization, only the slow rhythm of a heart that beats once every 100,000 years. Human lives are too brief to feel that rhythm. We live too fast. We love fast, forget fast. But Earth, she remembers slowly, lives slowly, and heals slowly. Each ice age is a low note in the symphony that has played for 4.5 billion years, a symphony in which we've only heard the opening bars. From a historian's point of view, history is not just the story of humankind, it is Earth's memory, written by human hands. And in that great epic, the ice ages are the punctuation marks, dividing chapters of life. Each time the planet inhales, life contracts, the fragile vanish. Each time it exhales, a new biological revolution begins. Without the ice ages, there would be no evolution. Without repetition, no awareness. It is ironic that the cold indifference of nature is what taught humanity to cherish warmth. Without darkness, we would never understand light. Without the ages of ice, we would never value a single flame in the night. When you understand this, you begin to see ice and snow not as enemies, but as the slow heartbeat of a colossal mother. One who keeps this world alive, even as her children are learning how to burn it. Now that we have learned to hear that heartbeat, let us go deeper, into the planet's bloodstream where the ice begins to melt, where giant beasts roam, and where humanity first learned to survive in the shadow of snow. Next, we will journey into the realm of giants, where wind and ice together shaped an age both majestic and solitary. Because when the planet begins to inhale once more, it isn't only the land that transforms, but every living being upon it, including us. The wind moves across an endless plain, the sky is a heavy gray, and the sun, pale, that distant, burns like a dying ember behind a curtain of snow. In the far distance, clouds drift slow and low, and beneath them, a world of ice stirs, quiet, patient, alive. This was the age of giants, a time when every footstep pressed deeper than a man's height, a time when cold itself wore a crown. For in this world, ice was the king, and every living creature, no matter how mighty or small, was only its subject. Across the vast lands of Europe and Siberia stretched a kingdom of frost and wind, the mammoth steppe. It was neither forest nor desert. It was an ocean of frozen grass, dry and sharp as glass, rolling endlessly toward the horizon. The wind never stopped. It carved the ground, polished the mountains, and whispered through the bones of the earth. There, life moved slowly, measured not by hours but by seasons of survival. Leading the march were the woolly mammoths, immense, solemn, wrapped in thick, rust-colored hair. Their curved tusks shone like twin moons. Each step they took sent a deep tremor through the ground, a sound like the slow heartbeat of the planet. Beside them walked the woolly rhinoceroses, armored beasts, their long horns slicing through the snow, clearing paths for others to follow. Behind them came the ancient bison, dark and heavy, their breath rising in white clouds that mingled with the wind. High above, snow vultures circled patiently, tracing the shape of destiny in the sky. And far behind, the dire wolves moved in silence, eyes yellow and cold, watching, waiting. In this frozen kingdom, life existed in delicate balance. Every creature fed another. Every death meant warmth for something else. No one ruled forever. No one escaped the laws of the ice. Beneath cliffs of frozen blue, hidden in shadow, a pair of golden eyes glimmer. The saber-toothed cat. Silent, still. It waits. When the wind shifts, when a bison strays too far, when the sound of breath falters, it strikes. Two curved fangs plunge deep, swift and precise as destiny. These cats did not chase, they did not roar. They killed like ghosts. Their purpose was not cruelty, but balance. Farther north, in caves rimmed with ice, the cave lions prowled, larger than any lion alive today. They hunted in packs, their roars rolling through the valleys like thunder trapped beneath snow. And the dire wolves, the ancient hunters of the plains, worked as one body, one mind. Each move rehearsed by instinct. Each hunt a dance between hunger and hope. Yet even these predators, fierce as they were not kings. They were the soldiers of the cold, the enforcers of nature's quiet law. Without them, the herds would overrun the land. Without the herds, the grass would die. And when the grass dies, the snow returns. Everything was held in fragile, sacred balance. Imagine looking down from the clouds. You would see patterns, not chaos. Herds flowing like rivers of muscle and fur, wolves tracing invisible lines in the snow, and even death itself moving in rhythm. This was not disorder, it was design. Every fall, every hunt, every meal, a note in a song older than time. The Ice Age was not a frozen prison. It was a living system, precise and self-correcting. And over it all, the ice ruled in silence. No decree, no voice, just the weight of a cold that needed no words to be obeyed. And then, on the edge of this kingdom, came us. Small, frail, naked against the wind, but carrying something new, fire. Early humans huddled in caves wrapped in fur, eyes wide before the storm. Through cracks in the stone, they saw mammoths drifting across the white horizon, monuments of flesh and time. They felt fear, but also awe. They began to draw. On the walls of their shelters, they painted what they saw. Mammoths, bison, lions, and themselves. Lines of charcoal, strokes of red ochre. Records of memory, of reverence, of belonging. They did not yet rule the world. They simply listened to it, learned its rhythm, moved with its breath. When they hunted, they whispered thanks to the fallen. When they killed, they buried the bones. Because they understood what the ice had already taught every living thing. To survive here, you must respect what sustains you. In this world, no crown shone brighter than the ice itself. No throne stood higher than the glacier walls gleaming under pale sun. No empire lasted longer. The Ice King ruled with silence. He needed no armies. His weapon was time. When the world grew loud, he returned. When life spread too far, he closed his hand. He erased and then rebuilt. For ice was not death, it was memory, a pause between breaths. A reminder that every age, no matter how mighty, must learn to kneel. The mammoths bowed first, then the cats, then the wolves. And finally, one day, even we. To look back at this age is to look into a mirror where the earth was wilder but wiser. Nothing wasted, nothing taken without purpose. Every creature, giant or small, had its place in the song, and when one note ended, another rose to take its place. We, the distant descendants, have forgotten that rhythm. We build louder empires, but more fragile ones. We believe we've escaped the cold, but maybe the cold never left. Maybe it just waits, beneath the rhythm of our lives, for the next breath in. I wonder. Where are you hearing this from? Is it night where you are, or morning? Is the world around you quiet enough that you can almost hear the wind from that ancient plain? If this story has stirred something in you, if you can feel the hush of snow or the slow heartbeat of the planet, I'd be grateful if you left a small sign, a like, a follow, not out of duty, but as a whisper back to this tale, so that it might drift a little farther, reach another curious soul, and remind them too that long ago ice was king, and we were just children learning to keep a fire alive in his shadow. The wind never stopped. It moved across the ice like a whisper from another world, steady, ancient, and cold enough to carve memory into stone. For thousands of years, this was the kingdom of beasts, of mammoths and rhinos, lions and wolves. But somewhere hidden between their heavy footsteps walked something else. Something smaller, more fragile, more dangerous. A creature that carried no tusks, no claws, no armor. Only a fragile spark, a mind trembling in the dark. They gathered in small groups, no larger than a family. A handful of men and women crouched in the hollow of a cave, the air thick with smoke. Firelight danced across their faces, faces not unlike ours. Beneath layers of fur and soot, you could see their eyes. Alert, calculating, alive. Outside, the world howled. The night was filled with the groan of glaciers, the distant rumble of collapsing ice. But in that tiny circle of warmth, something extraordinary flickered. Not just flame, but thought. They spoke in gestures and half-words. They planned, remembered, imagined. And for the first time in the long, cold history of the earth, intelligence burned brighter than instinct. Fire was not only warmth, it was defiance. Against the snow, against extinction. Each spark that rose into the black was a declaration. We will not go quietly. They learned to harden wood in the flame, to sharpen bone into knives. They wrapped hides around their bodies, sewed with sinew and fishbone. Every invention was born not from comfort, but from desperation. Necessity became the mother of memory. When dawn came, if you could call that dim light dawn, they ventured out. Across the frozen plains, the air was so sharp it burned the lungs. Their footprints pressed deep into the snow, vanishing behind them as the wind erased their passage. They moved in silence, spears held low, eyes scanning the white horizon. Ahead, mammoths grazed near the river of ice, enormous, ancient, unaware. The hunters waited for hours, sometimes days. When the time came, they struck with precision and fear. It was not courage, it was hunger. Every throw of the spear was a prayer that their children might live one more day. And when the beast finally fell, the earth trembled. They approached carefully, whispering words we will never know. They touched its tusk, its flank, its blood. Not in triumph, but in awe. They had taken life from the king of the cold. They knew the price. Nothing was wasted. The meat fed the tribe. The bones became tools. The sinew became thread. The hide became shelter. Even the memory became myth. Hokang? When the hunt was done, they returned to their caves. And there, in the flicker of the dying fire, they began to speak in another way, not with sound, but with symbol. They dipped their hands in ochre and charcoal. They pressed them against stone. Red palms, black lines, spirals, dots, the first words of a language older than writing. Some drew the mammoth, great and patient. Some drew the lion, mouth open in silent roar. Others traced the outlines of their own bodies as if to say, I was here. I survived. Remember me. These were not decorations. They were anchors. In a world ruled by frost and silence, painting was a way to exist, to push back against the endless white. And somewhere, deep in the back of the cave, one child, maybe 8, maybe 9, pressed a hand smaller than all the others. It stayed there, frozen in time, a fragile print of humanity's persistence. 30,000 years later, it still waits. They did not know why the world was cold. They did not understand stars or orbits or the tilt of the Earth. But they knew the rhythm. They could feel the planet breathe. The long inhale of the glaciers, the slow exhale of thaw. Each migration followed that breath. Each birth, each death, part of the same pulse. They did not see themselves as separate from the Earth. They were its children, bone of its bone, heat of its fire. At night, when the wind screamed over the mountains, they would sit by the fire and listen, to the crack of ice, to the whisper of snow against the stone walls. And perhaps, in those sounds, they heard the voice of something greater. Not a god, but the Earth itself. It spoke in tremors and storms. It tested them. And slowly, painfully, it taught them how to endure. Generations passed. Children became hunters, hunters became elders, elders became stories told by firelight, and through it all the small ones endured. They spread across valleys, rivers, and continents of ice. Each campfire became a lighthouse in the frozen sea of the world. Each flame whispered to the next, "We are still here." Their bones rest now beneath layers of silt and snow. Their tools lie buried in the frozen soil, but their thoughts remain. Carved into stone, carried in our blood, pulsing with the same quiet defiance. They were not kings. They were not conquerors. They were the memory of survival, the spark that refused to die when the wind tried to take it. And perhaps that is why, when we light a fire today in a forest or a home, or even in the glow of a screen, something ancient stirs within us, a whisper older than language, a reminder that once, long ago, in a world ruled by giants and ice, we were the small ones, but the fire was ours. Imagine the Earth asleep, not the kind of sleep we know, not hours or dreams, but a slumber that lasts for centuries. The air itself heavy, the oceans silent, the land locked in glass. For thousands of years, the planet has been holding its breath, and now, at last, it begins to stir. The age of giants is ending. The ice, once proud and unshakable, begins to crack. Far beneath the frozen crust, something is shifting, a deep growl from the heart of the Earth. And one morning, in a place we now call Sumatra, the planet opens its eyes. It began without warning. The ground trembled. Once, twice, like a pulse trying to return after long silence. Then came the sound. Not thunder, not explosion. A roar so vast, so ancient, that it seemed to come from the bones of the world itself. The supervolcano Toba had awakened. In moments, the earth tore open, a wound 100 kilometers long. The sky turned red, then black. Ash erupted upward with the force of creation itself, rising higher than any storm, higher than any mountain. A single column of fire, 10 times more powerful than all the nuclear bombs humanity would ever build, pierced the heavens. The blast shattered mountains, vaporized forests, silenced rivers. The land burned, then disappeared beneath a rain of molten rock. Within days, Southeast Asia was buried under a gray shroud several meters thick. And within weeks, the world began to die. Ash drifted across the oceans, blotting out the sun. Days turned into twilight, twilight turned into night. Plants withered, animals starved, and the delicate balance of life that had survived the long cold began to unravel. It was not just destruction, it was reset, the earth rewriting itself. In Greenland's ice cores, the evidence still whispers. Layers of ash, frozen like pages in a book of tragedy. Each layer marks another week of the eruption, another wave of fallout. 10 billion tons of sulfur dioxide filled the sky, spreading like a veil. And when that veil circled the globe, the sun disappeared. For the first time in 100,000 years, the earth lost its light. Temperatures plunged. Crops, what little grew in the tropics, failed. Forests turned to skeletons of ash. Rain became acid, biting into the soil. Even the oceans grew dark, choked by floating dust that blocked the light of life beneath the waves. It was not a season. It was an era, the volcanic winter. And for humanity it was a reckoning. Our ancestors, who had just begun to flourish across Africa and Asia, were suddenly surrounded by silence. The great herds vanished. The rivers turned bitter. And one by one, the small bands of early humans dwindled, scattered, or disappeared entirely. Genetic evidence tells us that almost 99% of humankind was lost. From hundreds of thousands of individuals, Only a few thousand survived, perhaps even fewer. They were not kings or warriors. They were gatherers, shellfish hunters, coastal wanderers, the ones who stayed near the sea when the land failed. And in that narrow margin of life, the story of humanity was rewritten. South Africa. A narrow cave overlooking the ocean. Inside, traces of ash on the walls, charred shells of mussels and limpets. This is Pinnacle Point, one of the few places where humanity's flame did not go out. Here, people learned to live not on grass and game, but on tides and patience. When the land starved, the sea fed them. They learned the rhythm of the moon, the pull of the tides, the habits of fish and birds. They built tools more delicate than before, tiny, precise, made for survival rather than strength. They heated stone before shaping it, unlocking sharper edges. They mixed pigments from ochre and fat, painting marks on rock, symbols, perhaps prayers or memories. In that dark cave, surrounded by cold and hunger, they became something new. Not just animals that adapt, but beings that imagine. Every shell cracked open was an act of defiance. Every spark of ochre on the wall, a promise whispered to the future. We will remember this. And we did, because from those survivors, all of us descend. Every heartbeat, every word, every dream that has ever existed comes from those who refused to die when the sky fell. Outside, the planet struggled to recover. The ash that had killed now began to settle, slowly, like gray snow. For years the sun was veiled, the air bitter with sulfur. Then slowly the light returned. When the clouds parted, the world was unrecognizable. Forests were gone. The land was stripped bare, a desert of dust and stone. The ocean's surface shimmered with a thin film of acid, lifeless and still. Entire species were erased, their bones buried beneath layers of ash and ice. But even in this wasteland, the earth was not dead. Underneath the ruins, seeds waited. Spores, roots, tiny forms of life, patient as stone. When the warmth returned, they rose again, painting green over gray. It would take centuries, perhaps 1,000 years, for the world to breathe freely once more. But it did. Because the earth, like its children, refuses to give up its fire. When the ice retreated and the skies cleared, something stirred among the survivors. The long winter had done more than shrink their numbers. It had sharpened them. They began to think differently, plan further ahead, cooperate more deeply. They learned to share food, ideas, hope. The mind itself evolved, sculpted by catastrophe. And with that change came art, language, ritual, the birth of humanity as we know it. In Africa's southern caves, red ochre drawings multiplied. In Europe, years later, people would carve ivory into the shapes of animals they barely remembered. They began to tell stories of beasts, of spirits of the sky, not just to explain, but to endure. They were not only surviving, they were meaning-making creatures. For the first time, they saw the world and asked, why? That question, quiet, trembling, was more powerful than fire. It was the spark that would light civilizations. The Toba eruption was not the first time the Earth had rewritten itself, and it would not be the last. Every few 100,000 years, the planet reshapes its surface, ice, fire, water, wind, erasing what came before. But in this particular rewriting, something new remained. Us. We became the memory of the Earth. The volcano nearly erased us, and yet it also forged us, compressing all the scattered potential of the human species into a single, enduring thread. It was an evolutionary bottleneck, yes, but also a purification, a refining of consciousness itself. When we look at the stars today, we are not separate from that catastrophe. We are its children. Every fear we conquer, every light we invent, carries a shadow of that night when the world went dark. And maybe that's why we build fires even now. In our homes, in our hearts, in our cities. Because somewhere deep in our blood, we still remember that once, long ago, fire was all that stood between us and extinction. 1,000 years after the eruption, the earth began to bloom again. Grass returned to the plains, rivers carved new paths through the softened land. The air grew sweet with the scent of rebirth. The survivors stepped out from the shadows of their caves. They looked at the horizon, at the sea, the sky, the still smoking mountains, and felt something they had never felt before. The future. The glaciers were retreating. The days grew longer. And in that fragile window between cold and warmth, life began to rush forward. Mammoths still roamed. Bison, wolves, and men shared the same trails. But something had shifted. The humans no longer moved blindly through the cold. They carried stories now, memories. The knowledge that even when the world ends, it can begin again. They built new tools, new languages, new songs, each word a spark, each song a flame. And so the dark, volcanic night that almost ended humanity became instead the night that defined it. The earth too seemed changed. The crust cooled, the air cleared, and somewhere in the silence of recovery, the planet began another heartbeat. The continents shifted slightly, ocean currents awoke, winds rebalanced, clouds found new homes. The planet had survived its own convulsion. It had burned away the excess, shed the weight of life, and started anew. Lighter, wiser, calmer. If you could stand there, on that reborn earth, you might feel it, the sense of something vast breathing again. A sigh that rolls across mountains, a whisper that says, it's not over. Begin again. And we did. The humans walked once more beneath open skies. They followed the rivers, the stars, the changing winds. They found beauty in the cracks of ash and built hope out of ruins. Because that's what life does. It fills the silence. Today, the crater of Toba is a lake. Calm, blue, serene. Tourists visit it, take photos, admire its beauty. They don't see what it hides. But beneath that mirror of water lies the scar of the world's greatest eruption. A wound and a reminder. Every handful of soil, every breath we take carries traces of that ancient ash. It is in the sediment of rivers, in the glaciers of Antarctica, in our very DNA. The earth does not forget. And neither, it seems, do we. For even now we dream of fire and ash, of endings and beginnings. We tell stories about destruction, not because we love it, but because we recognize it. Because deep down, we know. Rebirth always begins in ruin. When the last ash fell and the sun returned, the survivors might have stepped outside and seen something they'd never seen before. The color blue. The sky, clear for the first time in years. The ocean glittering like a new promise. They must have felt small, smaller than ever. And yet, something inside them burned brighter than all the suns they could not yet name. The earth had tried to erase them. Instead, it had made them unforgettable. The volcano sleeps now. But somewhere deep beneath its calm waters, heat still stirs, slow, patient, eternal, waiting for the next breath. For this planet, like its children, never truly rests. It dies and lives and dies again. Each time, remembering, each time beginning anew. The sun vanished. Not completely, but enough that its warmth felt like a rumor, a story told by firelight. Days became a dim, cold twilight. Nights stretched so long that the stars seemed frozen in place, and in that half-light, the world began to die quietly. After the great eruption, the planet fell into a silence deeper than any before. No songs of birds, no hum of insects, only wind, thin, hollow, wandering across the ice like a lost ghost. The seas turned gray. The forests were gone. And what little remained of life crouched low to the ground, clinging to warmth that wasn't there. It was not just a winter of weather. It was a winter of memory. The kind that seeps into the bones of the world and lingers for centuries. Snow fell even in places where it had never dared before. The deserts of Africa gleamed white for the first time in their existence. The jungles of Asia fell silent beneath frost, and in the heart of every storm the earth whispered one word over and over again: rest. It was as if the planet, exhausted by fire, had decided to sleep again. But this time there was no dream, only endurance. The people, what few remained, withdrew deeper into caves, into hollows, into silence. They learned that survival was not a fight, but a waiting, a slow, patient waiting. They shared warmth the way they once shared stories, by touch, by breath, by presence. They pressed close together when the wind howled, their bodies the last embers of the animal world. Sometimes they must have wondered if the sun would ever return, if light was gone for good, if the sky had turned its face away from them forever. Each morning, if morning could still be called that, the horizon glowed faintly, a gray blush. No real sunrise, just a suggestion of one. And that suggestion was enough. They would rise, stretch their stiff limbs, check the traps, search for anything edible. Frozen roots, dead birds, sometimes nothing. The great animals, mammoths, bison, lions, had retreated or fallen. Those that lived became thin, ghostly versions of themselves. The balance that once ruled the steppe had broken. Now everything hunted everything. Even the air seemed to feed on warmth. And yet, through that famine of life, small miracles persisted. At the edges of the sea, where volcanic heat still bled through the crust, the water steamed faintly. There, among the rocks, tiny crabs, limpets, and shellfish endured. They became the treasure of humankind, their only food, their only salvation. The survivors learned to follow the tides. They learned to listen, not to the roar of beasts, but to the rhythm of the waves. The sea, though wounded, still spoke. It was the only voice that hadn't gone silent. At night, they huddled around fires so small they looked like stars fallen to earth. They guarded each flame like a heartbeat. They whispered to it, fed it, pleaded with it not to die. Sometimes when the wind grew too strong and the fire went out, they sat in darkness for hours, too tired to move. And in that darkness, they dreamed of light. Not of the old world, but of something beyond it. Perhaps that was when imagination began. Not art, not story, but the idea of tomorrow. Because hope is a strange thing. It burns even when there's nothing left to feed it. Years passed like this. The sun remained hidden behind a shroud of ash. Snow melted, then froze again. Seasons blurred. Time itself became heavy. Children were born under the gray sky and grew old without ever seeing true blue. They never saw the full sun, only the dim light of a world remembering how to live. But even that was enough for life to hold on. Just barely. The human mind, faced with extinction, began to change. They became quieter, sharper, more cunning. They remembered where warmth came from, not from the sky, but from within, and that memory became evolution. Each generation carried the lesson of survival deeper into their bones. And one day, when the veil began to lift, the descendants of those who had waited walked out of their caves and blinked against the light. The sun had returned, not bright, not yet, but real. And for the first time in years, shadows fell again upon the earth. They stood in that fragile sunlight as if afraid to move, afraid that it might vanish again if they reached for it. But it didn't. It stayed. Slowly, the frost began to soften. Streams began to flow. Moss crawled back across the rocks, and from that green the earth began to breathe again. No one recorded the day the light truly came back. No one could. But maybe, just maybe, someone among them looked to the sky and wept. Not out of joy. Not out of grief, but out of recognition. Because somewhere deep inside they knew the truth that would echo through every age to come. The earth had not saved them. It had tested them, and they had endured. That was enough. Enough to start again. Even now, the memory of that winter lingers. Every glacier, every snowstorm, every chill that seeps into our bones. They are echoes of that silence. The world once stopped. And yet we are here. The children of those who refuse to fade. The inheritors of a sky that nearly forgot the sun. And when we step outside on a cold morning and see our breath rise in pale clouds, we are not merely breathing air, we are breathing history. The same air that once turned the world to ice, the same light that once disappeared, the same warmth that somehow we carried through the dark. For though the sun had vanished, we kept its fire alive. And that was enough. The sky was pale and thin, the color of ash washed clean by tears. The long winter had finally begun to loosen its grip. The world was quiet, but no longer dead. And in that quiet, something moved. Something small, something human. For the first time in millennia, smoke began to rise again from the earth. Not from volcanoes, not from destruction, but from life. From small fires flickering at the edge of the sea. From the hands of those who refused to disappear. They were the survivors. Not heroes, not kings. Just people, frightened, clever, patient. And in their patience, the story of humankind began again. They lived in places where the sea still whispered warmth, along the coasts of Africa, in the southern caves that looked out upon the endless gray of the ocean. There, they learned that the rhythm of survival was not war, but listening. The moon became their clock, the tide their teacher. When the land offered nothing, the ocean provided. Shellfish, crabs, small fish glittering like silver secrets in the tide pools. Every meal was a miracle. Every sunrise, a kind of forgiveness. In the dark mouth of a cave at Pinnacle Point, they built fires and watched the waves. The children drew lines in the sand. The elders watched the sky and spoke of things that had no name. Stars, perhaps, or gods. And in those fragile gatherings, humanity learned something it had never known before. That survival was not only a matter of flesh, but of memory. At night, they worked stone in the glow of the flames. The old, heavy tools, the crude hand axes of the past, were too clumsy for this new world. Now they needed precision, efficiency, grace. They learned to heat stone before striking it, to temper it, make it sharper, more obedient. They began to fasten stone blades to wooden handles with sinew and resin, creating the first composite tools. Small, deliberate, intelligent. Each tool was a conversation, between mind and matter, between imagination and necessity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something within the human hand changed. It became an instrument of intention. It began to mirror thought. That was when the world shifted. No longer did they merely adapt to the earth. They began to reshape it. Among the ashes of disaster, color returned. The survivors found red ochre, soft, iron-rich stone that left marks like dried blood. They ground it into powder, mixed it with animal fat, smeared it on skin, on stone, on bone. No one knows exactly why. Maybe it was for beauty, maybe for faith, maybe for remembrance. But in that act, in that gesture of making meaning, humanity crossed a threshold no other creature had ever crossed. For to mark something in red, to draw on a wall or a body, is to say, I was here, I mattered. And from that single sentence, everything else, art, language, history, would eventually follow. In the mornings, mist clung to the ocean like a second sky. They learned to read it, the signs of wind, the scent of salt. They timed their foraging to the moon, knowing that the pull of the tides could mean life or death. They built patterns, rituals, and shared them. They became storytellers before they even had words. Every gesture meant something. A hand raised toward the horizon could mean hunger, danger, or hope. A single look could carry the weight of 1,000 fears. Communication became art, and art became the soul of survival. It was not strength that saved them, it was cooperation. It was imagination. Those who hunted alone vanished. Those who shared endured. And in the spaces between one fire and the next, the fragile thread of humanity began to weave itself together again. They must have looked different by then, leaner, quieter, with eyes that had seen too much. But inside those eyes flickered something no catastrophe could extinguish: curiosity. When the seas calmed and the skies cleared, they ventured farther. They followed rivers inland, tracing new paths through a reshaped land. The ice had retreated, but it had left behind open plains, new valleys, and bridges of earth where there had once been sea. The world was vast, and for the first time, it felt conquerable. But they did not conquer it with violence. They conquered it with wonder. As generations passed, their tools became smaller, more refined, their hands more confident. They carved beads from bone, strung them on sinew, adornment not of vanity, but of identity. A declaration that even after the near death of the species, they were still human enough to care about beauty. They buried their dead with care, leaving shells and ochre and carved stones beside the bodies. Not just disposal, but mourning. Grief itself became an invention. To grieve is to remember, and to remember is to resist extinction. The caves began to glow not only with fire, but with meaning. Red shapes on walls, spirals, lines, hands. Each mark a conversation with the darkness. Each mark a way of saying to the world, you may silence us, but we will not vanish without leaving our name upon the stone. Sometimes, when the wind outside grew too strong, they would listen to the sea's distant thunder and whisper to their children that it was the voice of the earth, that the planet itself was alive, dreaming, waiting. And perhaps, in a way, it was true. For as they healed, so did the earth. The volcano's scars filled with water. Green returned to the hills. Animals came back. Not the same as before, but new, smaller, humbler. The world had reset, and humankind had been rewritten. The survivors were the children of that rewriting, the distilled essence of everything that had come before. Their minds, shaped by crisis, became quick and adaptive. Their memories, sharpened by fear, became stories. Their hearts, scarred by loss, became capable of compassion. When they looked to the horizon, they no longer saw only danger. They saw possibility. They saw the future. And when they gazed at the stars reflected in the sea, perhaps they wondered, as we still do, what other fires burned out there? What other worlds had survived their own winters? They did not know it then, but in surviving, they had changed not only themselves, but the destiny of the entire planet. For through them, the earth learned to remember. Every story since, every city, every song, every act of love or cruelty would be a ripple of that moment in time when a handful of humans refused to let the fire die. And so, the winter passed. The ice melted. The sun returned. But deep beneath the calm of the new world, the memory of ash still burned. Not as a curse, but as a quiet promise that no matter how many times the earth tries to erase itself, life will find a way to begin again. It began with sound, not thunder, not wind, but something slower, heavier, the deep groaning sigh of ice beginning to move. For thousands of years, the world had been frozen still. Mountains of ice, tall as gods, had held the continents in their grip. Now, under the timid warmth of a returning sun, those giants began to weep. Drop by drop, rivulet by rivulet, an empire of silence dissolving into water. And as the ice withdrew, the world beneath it was revealed. A new earth, raw and gleaming, like a scar that had just begun to heal. The rivers came first. Thin threads of meltwater trickling down through canyons carved by glaciers long before memory. Then lakes, great blue mirrors forming in the hollows left behind. And finally, the seas rose again, creeping into the lowlands like a cautious tide reclaiming lost ground. But for a while there was something wondrous, a brief, miraculous balance between the retreating ocean and the lifting land. The ice had pushed the Earth's crust down under its weight. Now, freed from that burden, the continents rose. Slowly, gracefully. Bridges of land emerged where there had once been waves, from England to Europe, Doggerland, from Asia to Alaska, Beringia, from the islands of Southeast Asia to the vast mainland, Sunda. Paths that had never existed before now lay open like invitations. And humanity, curious as ever, stepped across. They were wanderers now, children of a world being born anew. They followed the edges of the melting ice, where rivers met the sea and fish filled the thawing waters. They walked across valleys that shimmered with the first green of spring. They carried with them nothing but tools, stories, and the stubborn memory of survival. Everywhere they went, the earth changed. The soil, enriched by ash and decay, burst into color. Grasses spread, forests took root. The great plains, once wastelands of snow and wind, turned gold beneath the sun. For the first time, the world smelled of life again. Wet earth, blooming flowers, smoke, and the air, once thick with ash, carried something new, the sound of laughter. At first, the animals returned. The mammoths roamed north, chasing the cold as it retreated. Reindeer and bison grazed the endless tundra. Woolly rhinoceroses, musk oxen, and lions followed. But behind them came something different, something the ice could never understand. Humans. They walked the bridges of the world like explorers of a forgotten dream. Across Doggerland, they hunted and gathered in meadows where whales had once swum. Across Beringia, they followed herds into the great unknown, the first footsteps into what would one day be called the Americas. Across Sunda, they watched the sun rise over new islands and wondered if the gods lived beyond the horizon. Each journey was a gamble, each step a prayer. But they had learned something the ice had not, that fear and wonder are the same thing, seen from different sides of the fire. The earth was changing faster than ever before. Rivers flooded, mountains cracked, the air shimmered with warmth and uncertainty. Yet within that chaos, humanity thrived. They followed herds. They built shelters from bone and hide. They learned to store food, to fish, to shape canoes that could ride the restless waters. Some settled by rivers, planting seeds without yet knowing the word for agriculture. Others continued wandering, drawn ever onward by the lure of the horizon. Everywhere they went, they left marks. A handprint on a rock, a circle of stones where a fire once burned, the broken bones of a meal shared long ago. They were not merely passing through, they were claiming memory. The glaciers continued to shrink, and as they did, the sea began to rise. The bridges of land, those miraculous pathways between worlds, began to sink again, one by one. Doggerland drowned beneath the North Sea. Sunda broke apart into the islands we know today, Java, Sumatra, Borneo. Beringia vanished under icy water, separating Asia from the newborn Americas. The gates had closed, but by then humanity had already crossed. The map of our species was written. The earth had divided, not to isolate, but to diversify, and each separated tribe, each wandering group, began to evolve its own reflection of the same story. They spoke in different tongues, painted in different styles, but their songs all told the same truth. We came from the cold, and we carried fire in our hands. Imagine that moment, when the last wall of ice collapsed into the sea, a thunder louder than anything ever heard before, an entire glacier breaking free, shattering into floating islands of blue. The oceans rose, swallowing the shores, reshaping the continents. But there must have been beauty too, the kind that hurts to look at. Rainbows caught in melting mist, the echo of waterfalls roaring where silence once reigned, the earth shimmering like new skin beneath sunlight it had not felt in an age. Perhaps the people watching from the hills understood none of it. Perhaps they only knew that the world was moving again. Alive, restless, unstoppable. And that somewhere within that motion, they had a place. The thaw was not gentle. It was magnificent and terrible. Many died in floods. Many starved when hunting grounds vanished beneath water. But humanity did not despair. They built rafts, they followed the fish, they adapted. Because that's what they had become. Not the strongest species, not the fastest, but the one that remembered how to change. The glaciers withdrew to the poles. The plains turned to forests. The air warmed. The sky deepened to a color no one had seen for thousands of years, a pure, forgiving blue. And beneath that blue, humans lifted their faces, their voices, and their hearts. They began to dream again, dreams not of survival but of meaning. They watched the stars and wondered what waited beyond them. They painted not out of fear but out of love. They carved figures, women, animals, gods, celebrations of fertility, of beauty, of life's persistence. They told stories of how the ice had once ruled, how the sun had vanished, how their ancestors had survived the long night. In every telling the same refrain, the world ended and began again. If the earth could speak, it would have sighed then, a sigh of relief, of forgiveness, of awe. It had nearly destroyed its children, and yet somehow they had become its voice. The glaciers were gone, but their memory remained, in the rivers they left behind, in the valleys they carved, and in us. Because the truth is simple and eternal, the ice never really leaves. It only sleeps, waiting for the next heartbeat of the planet. And perhaps, just perhaps, somewhere beneath the calm blue lakes and the quiet soil, the old ice still dreams. Dreams of the time when it ruled the earth, and all living things bowed beneath its silence. Dreams of the age when it was king, and we were only its trembling, stubborn children clutching our fires, following the melt, learning to live again. The age of ice had ended, but the earth had not yet settled. It never truly does. Every breath of warmth carries with it the ghost of cold, and in the shadow of melting glaciers, a new kind of silence took shape, not the stillness of frost, but the stillness of dust. The world was awake again, yes, but it was still learning how to breathe. The glaciers had withdrawn to the poles, leaving behind vast plains of powder, fine silt ground by centuries of ice, lifted easily by the smallest wind. And when the wind came, as it always does, it rose in waves, carrying the memory of mountains into the sky. The air was no longer white with snow. It was pale with dust. Veils of it stretched across continents, soft and quiet as fog, but sharp enough to scrape lungs raw. The wind sang through empty valleys and dry riverbeds. It howled through canyons carved by the melting ice. It filled the air with the scent of minerals and ghosts. In this new age, the world was rebuilding itself grain by grain. For a long while, the weather forgot how to choose. Too dry for forests, too cold for deserts. The seasons blurred, each one a hesitant attempt at balance. Rain came in fits, and when it fell, it tore the land apart, turning dust into rivers, rivers into mud, mud into new soil. It was not destruction, but renewal. A slow, uneven kind of creation. Like an artist unsure of their brushstrokes, painting the same line again and again until the shape of a continent emerged. The creatures that had survived the thaw learned to follow the wind. Birds migrated across half the planet, following invisible rivers of air. Herds of grazing animals moved with the seasons, tracing the path of rain. And behind them, always behind them, came the humans. They walked through the wind, their footprints erased within hours, their faces wrapped in skins against the dust. They were still wanderers, but now their wandering had purpose. They were not just surviving. They were learning the rhythm of the world. They began to see patterns, how stars rose and fell in time with the seasons, how the wind shifted before the rain, how certain plants grew only after certain storms. The world was no longer chaos. It was a language, and humans were beginning to read it. In the plains of Eurasia, winds carried fine yellow soil, loess, from the north. It settled in thick blankets, soft as flour, rich with nutrients. And wherever it landed, life followed. Grasses grew, then flowers, then forests. The land that had been crushed by ice now pulsed with green veins of fertility. The earth was rebuilding its skin. But the wind was not only a giver, it was a reminder. It whispered of impermanence. It told the story of how everything, mountains, rivers, civilizations, would one day crumble to dust and be carried away again. To live in that world was to live with humility. The people who wandered the plains learned to move lightly, to build only what they could leave behind. Their tents rose and fell with the seasons. Their fires burned low so the smoke would not anger the sky. Every step was temporary. Every home was borrowed. They were tenants of the wind. At night, they lay beneath the stars, watching the dust shimmer in the moonlight, tiny, floating fragments of everything that had ever existed. The same particles that had once been part of glaciers, part of mountains, part of bones. And maybe they understood, even without words, that they too would one day join that endless dance. That life and dust were the same thing, just at different speeds. Sometimes the wind grew cruel. It rose without warning, a wall of grit and shadow that erased the sun. It swept across the plains, flattening tents, blinding eyes, burying tracks of entire journeys. The people huddled in circles, covering their faces, listening to the storm rage like an angry god. When it passed, the world looked different. The horizon had moved. The landscape itself had been rearranged. And yet, when the silence returned, they would rise again. Shake the dust from their hair, gather what was left, and continue walking. Because that's what the wind taught them, that movement was not a curse, but a form of survival. Over time, the dust gave birth to something unexpected. Stories. The people began to name the winds. They said some brought life and others death. They gave them tempers, faces, songs, and in doing so they found comfort in the invisible. The wind became more than a force, it became a messenger, carrying prayers, carrying smoke, carrying the breath of the dead into the stars. They began to believe that the soul was a kind of wind too, a breath that leaves the body and joins the great air of the world. Perhaps they were right. The earth had changed again, but this time, humanity had changed with it. They were no longer merely reacting to the planet's moods. They were learning to anticipate them, to live in rhythm with the unpredictable. The same dust that blinded them also fed their crops. The same wind that tore down their shelters also carried their songs across the plains. It was cruel and it was kind, like everything the earth had ever been. If you stood there now, on one of those ancient plains where mammoths once walked, you would feel it too, that endless breath of the planet moving past your face, soft, persistent, eternal. And if you listen closely enough, beneath the rush of air, you might still hear the faintest echo, a whisper of all that came before. Ash, ice, fire, life, all moving together as dust returns to dust. And perhaps that's the lesson the wind was trying to teach, that nothing on this earth is ever truly lost. It only changes form, it drifts, it waits, it begins again. The wind carried dust across the plains for generations. It shaped the world slowly, grain by grain, and in its wake something new began to stir, not in the soil but in the minds of those who walked upon it. The survivors of the cold had learned to endure, but endurance alone could not feed the hunger that now lived inside them. It was no longer the hunger for food, nor even for warmth. It was a hunger for meaning. For the first time, the humans looked at their own hands and saw not just flesh and bone, but potential. The story of fire had begun long ago, in the trembling light of the first volcanic glow, in the sparks of friction between stone and stone. But now, fire was no longer a discovery. It was an inheritance, a tool, a companion. Every tribe, every wandering family, carried it as they carried their own blood, wrapped in bark, hidden in embers, fed, protected, whispered to. When the wind howled across the plains, when the darkness grew too heavy, the fire was what reminded them they still belonged to the world of the living. It was a fragile magic, one that could die as easily as it was born. But in that fragility, there was also power. Fire was no longer just warmth, it was memory, a thread that bound the past to the future. One night, in a valley surrounded by cliffs, a small band gathered. The air was calm, the stars sharp as knives. In the center of their circle, a flame danced, its light painting the walls in gold and shadow. They sat together, silent. The fire crackled, and in its sound they heard stories. The eldest among them, gray hair matted with ash, eyes bright with reflection, reached into the firelight. He lifted a shard of flint, and with slow, deliberate rhythm began to shape it. Chip by chip, strike by strike, each spark that flew from the stone illuminated a face, a thought, a future. The others watched. Children leaned closer. This was not just toolmaking, it was ceremony. Because in those moments the act of shaping stone became the act of shaping thought itself. Every strike said, the world can be changed. The flint took form, a blade, then a point, then a tool that could cut meat, shape wood, carve bone. It was simple, but within that simplicity lived genius. When the elder finished, he placed it in the hands of a young boy. The child turned it over, eyes wide, seeing in it something sacred. Not the stone itself, but the idea that a human could make the world answer to their will. That idea would echo across millennia. The tribes of the plains became artisans of survival. They shaped bone into needles, hide into thread, stone into blades. They tamed the wild materials around them the way a poet tames words, with patience, with rhythm, with love. Each tool told a story of hands and heat, of minds that refused to be content with what simply was. The fire burned beside them, a second heart beating in time with their labor. The rhythm of hammer and spark became the rhythm of creation itself. And soon the making of tools became more than survival, it became art. They began to decorate. Handles carved with spirals, blades etched with lines that caught the light. Even simple bowls were smoothed and shaped as though made to be admired. Function became beauty, and beauty became meaning. It was the first time humanity looked at its own work and smiled, not because it was useful, but because it was theirs. Somewhere along the way, they learned to sing. Not songs as we know them, no language, no melody, just rising and falling sounds that mirrored the rhythm of work. The scraping of stone, the hiss of flame, the heartbeat beneath the ribs. Those songs filled the space between effort and exhaustion. They were not performances, they were prayers. Prayers not to gods, but to the act of making itself. For creation, whether by hand or by heart, was the closest thing to divinity they could touch. The fire changed them in ways even they could not see. It cooked their food, softening their bodies. It lit their nights, extending their days. It hardened their tools, shaping their minds. And in the glow of its light, they began to see reflections of themselves, flickering, shifting, uncertain but undeniable. The first mirrors were not of glass. They were pools of light in the eyes of others, caught across the flames. And in those reflections the idea of self was born. They began to paint again, not just animals, but symbols, lines that meant nothing and everything. Circles, spirals, hands, the language of creation still in its infancy. To make a mark upon the world was to say, I exist. To make it beautiful was to say, I understand. These were not small statements. They were the beginning of everything that would come, from architecture to poetry, from civilization to philosophy. Each spark from the fire was the ancestor of a star. Each tool, the ancestor of thought. Time passed differently in the firelight. Seasons came and went, but around the flames, the human story never truly changed. We have always gathered near the light, in caves, in hearths, in cities, always making, always shaping, always dreaming. Even now, when our fires burn in the glow of screens and cities, we are doing the same thing our ancestors did, trying to hold back the dark. When the winds carried dust, humans answered with fire. When the ice crushed the world, they answered with invention. When the earth itself turned against them, they learned to turn their fear into creation. Fire was never the enemy of nature. It was its conversation partner, a force that taught us what it meant to change without forgetting. Because every act of creation is also an act of destruction. Every flame consumes as it illuminates, and yet, without it, there would be nothing left to see. The fire taught us the simplest truth of all, that light to exist must burn, and so, humanity burned, for knowledge, for warmth, for wonder. Every forge, every song, every invention that would come after, the wheel, the temple, the city, the rocket, was already hidden in that first trembling spark struck between two stones. Perhaps that is why, even now, we find peace in the glow of fire. Because we remember, without knowing why, that this was the beginning, the moment we stopped being ruled by the earth and began to shape it in our own image. Not to conquer, but to understand. Not to own, but to create. The fire made us makers. And in its light, the story of the world entered a new chapter. One written not in ice or dust or stone, but in imagination. The fire did not just warm the night, it changed the rhythm of the world. With each spark, the darkness retreated a little farther, and humanity, once crouched in the shadows, began to stand upright. For the first time, they were no longer merely survivors, they were shapers. And that changed everything. Across the thawing plains and river valleys, the earth was generous again. The rivers swollen with meltwater carried silt, and wherever it settled, grass grew thicker, taller, sweeter. The animals returned, herds of deer, aurochs, wild horses, and behind them came the people, following the pulse of life as faithfully as they once followed the stars. They learned to stay longer in one place, to watch the seasons turn, to understand the language of roots and rain. And slowly, without realizing it, they became the children of the soil. It began with seeds. Someone, a woman perhaps, noticed that where old meals had been thrown away, new plants grew stronger. She began to scatter them on purpose. And one day she saw green shoot up from the ground, tender and soft, answering her gesture as if the earth itself had understood. That was the first conversation between humankind and the planet that birthed them. And the earth replied, "Yes, we can build this together." Farming was not an invention, it was a relationship. And like all relationships, it required sacrifice. The people learned to bend the land to their will, to cut, to burn, to clear, to shape water with ditches and stone. In doing so, they became stronger and also bound. Once you plant, you cannot wander. Once you build, you cannot flee. The great freedom of the hunter was replaced by the stillness of the farmer. Roots for roots. A trade of motion for memory. That was the first price of civilization. Villages appeared, first as clusters of tents near rivers, then as houses of clay and wood. Smoke rose not from campfires now, but from hearths, a sign that humanity had begun to stay. They tamed animals, built pens, crafted pottery to hold grain and water. Their hands, once hardened by the hunt, now shaped vessels, walls, altars. They no longer prayed to survive. They prayed for good weather, for the patience of the soil, for the mercy of time. And for a while it worked. The fields yielded, the rivers flowed, children grew fat and curious. Music and laughter returned to the evenings. The world had entered its first golden age, a fragile peace between man and nature. But peace, as the earth knows too well, never lasts. The same intelligence that had saved humanity from extinction was now restless. It wanted more. More crops, more land, more control. People began to build higher, dig deeper, burn brighter. They cut forests for fuel, they diverted rivers for irrigation, they cleared plains for grain. And slowly the balance began to tilt. The earth, once a partner, became a resource, a thing to be managed, not loved. And every blessing began to whisper its price. The skies grew hazy with smoke. The rivers once sacred began to choke on mud. The animals that had once roamed freely now fled the sound of axes and flame. And yet, humanity thrived. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Stone replaced wood. Walls rose to protect what was owned. The people had finally conquered the cold, only to find themselves trapped inside their own warmth. Fire had made them gods. And gods, as myths will later tell, always fall in love with their own reflection. In the heart of every settlement, there was always a flame, a hearth, a kiln, a forge. The fire that once united them now divided them. It built tools of beauty and weapons of ruin. It hardened clay into art and metal into power. Those who controlled fire began to control people. And with control came the oldest shadow of all, ambition. The first wars were not fought for survival, but for harvests, for cattle, for land, for ownership. The ground that had once been home to all became someone's. And blood, once spilled only in the hunt, now stained the soil for reasons no wind could understand. The hunter had become the builder. The builder had become the ruler, and the ruler had forgotten the fire's true lesson, that what gives life also consumes it. Still, the earth endured. It always does. It watched the rise of walls and towers the way it once watched glaciers grow, slowly, patiently, knowing that all things built too high must one day return to dust. The wind carried seeds again, the rivers cut new paths, The forests waited at the edges of the fields, silent, biding their time. For the planet does not take revenge, it only remembers. In those early cities, as the nights grew bright with firelight and sound, a few among them still looked up. They watched the stars and felt a strange ache, a longing for something older, something simpler, something beyond the walls. They told stories of the time before, when people spoke to rivers, when mountains were gods, when the earth itself was alive. And maybe, deep down, they understood that progress is not a straight road, but a circle, that every rise carries within it the seed of its own fall. But for now, they built, they dreamed, they filled the world with fire and song. They made tools that carved the bones of the earth and painted the air with smoke and prayer. And as they slept, the planet turned beneath them, slow, patient, forgiving. It had seen such stories before. It would see them again, because every civilization, no matter how bright its fire, burns on borrowed time. The ice had melted, the rivers had spoken, the wind had carried dust, and now fire had given birth to creation and to consequence. The rise was complete. The price had only just begun. The earth was no longer the same. Its pulse had quickened. Its surface shimmered with the light of countless fires. And from high above, if there had been eyes among the stars, our planet would have seemed to sparkle. Not with ice. Not with oceans, but with intelligence. Humanity had risen. And with its rise came a new sound, a sound the earth had never known before, the hum of thought. Villages had become cities. Cities had become kingdoms. And kingdoms were beginning to think in centuries rather than seasons. The rivers that once guided wanderers now served as borders. The hills that once sheltered hunters now held temples. The hands that once carved tools now shaped symbols, words, numbers, laws. In clay and stone, humans began to write the first memory of the mind. Marks pressed into tablets, records of harvests and trades, of debts and promises, of births and deaths. But somewhere between the lines of calculation, another kind of writing appeared. Stories. They were not for survival. They were for meaning. They spoke of gods born from the sea, of serpents that circled the world, of mountains that breathed, of skies that once burned with wrath. These myths were not delusions. They were the language of remembrance, echoes of real events retold in the only way the human heart could understand them, through wonder. The story of the Great Flood, whispered by so many cultures, was not born from fantasy. It was a memory of melting ice, of rising seas swallowing the lands their ancestors once walked upon. The old world was still speaking. But now humanity had found a way to listen with words. In the valleys of Mesopotamia, people tamed rivers and called them gods. In Egypt, they aligned stone with the stars, believing heaven itself could be measured. In the Indus and the Yellow River, they built cities of order and pattern, as if trying to mirror the symmetry of nature. It was the first time the earth saw its own reflection, in geometry, in architecture, in art. The planet that once shaped humanity was now being shaped by it. And yet, every creation carries its echo. Every triumph, its shadow. The more humans understood, the more they forgot. The more they measured the heavens, the more they lost the song of the earth beneath their feet. They began to speak of ownership not only of land, but of truth. The priest replaced the hunter. The scholar replaced the storyteller. The builder replaced the wanderer. Knowledge became a kind of hunger, a fire that no water could quench. But beneath the noise of civilization, the world was still breathing. The forest still murmured, the tide still sang, the wind still carried dust across the plains. And sometimes, when the city fires dimmed and the night grew quiet, you could still hear the old heartbeat, the slow rhythm of the planet remembering what it was before us. There were those who still listened, the dreamers, the shamans, the watchers of stars. They stood between two worlds, one ancient, one new, and tried to translate between them. They said the stars were not gods, but signs. That fire was not divinity, but reflection. That every element, earth, air, water, flame, was part of the same great body we all shared. Their voices were quiet, drowned beneath the clang of tools and the shouting of kings, but their words endured. Because truth, like fire, cannot be unlearned once it has been seen. The earth had not forgotten what it was, it had simply changed its language. The same cycles continued: the rain, the drought, the harvest, the flood. But now, instead of fleeing or adapting, humans tried to control them. They built dams to tame the water, walls to keep out the wind, rituals to bargain with the sky. And sometimes it worked. But each success brought a new arrogance, the illusion that nature could be owned, that creation itself was now in human hands. They called themselves kings of the earth. But the earth never crowned them. Still, for all its hubris, this was a magnificent time. In the glow of the firelight, ideas bloomed. Mathematics, music, astronomy. The wheel, the plow, the sail. Every invention was a way of asking the same ancient question: how do we survive the darkness? And every answer brought light, but also shadow. Because each tool that extended human reach also extended human harm. The bow that hunted became the bow that conquered. The fire that warmed became the fire that burned cities. The stone that built temples became the stone that sealed graves. Creation and destruction were now one and the same heartbeat. The earth, patient as always, watched and waited. It did not judge, it simply balanced. When the forests thinned, the desert spread. When rivers were dammed, floods grew stronger. When fields were sown too greedily, the soil grew tired and silent. The planet's voice was still there, but it had become quieter, more distant, a whisper lost beneath the rhythm of the forge. And yet, even in this noise, there were moments of grace. A mother teaching her child to shape clay, a craftsman carving birds into a temple wall, a farmer kneeling in the dawn light, hands dirty, heart humble. These were not acts of power, they were acts of remembrance. The last flickers of connection between humanity and its origin. Each act said, we still know who we are, even if we've forgotten how to listen. From the frozen caves of Africa to the cities of stone and bronze, the same truth lingered, that we are the continuation of the planet's dream. That in every hammer's strike, every line of poetry, every fire that still burns, the earth is speaking through us. We are not separate. We never were. We are the echoes of becoming, the planet's way of thinking out loud. And somewhere in that vast living silence, the next question was already forming. A question that would define the next age. If humanity has learned to create as gods, can it remember how to live as children of the earth? The cities shone, not with stars but with flame, thousands of them, scattered across valleys and coasts, flickering like constellations on the surface of the earth. From afar, it must have looked like the planet itself was dreaming again, its skin glowing with the pulse of new life. But dreams always have a shadow, and so did this one. The age of light had arrived, and with it, the first great forgetting. Humans no longer saw the earth as their mother. They saw it as a canvas, something to carve, to build upon, to master. Where once they followed the rhythms of the wind and tide, they now wrote their own. They straightened the curves of rivers, split mountains for stone, and drew borders on the skin of the world, lines that meant nothing to the earth itself. In doing so, they separated themselves not only from nature but from memory. They forgot that light can also blind. The fires of civilization burned brighter. Temples rose higher. Metals sang in forges that never cooled. The echo of hammers and wheels filled the air, and the night, once sacred, retreated to the edges of existence. The stars grew dim above the smoke. The people below stopped looking up. They had turned their eyes inward, to their own creations, their own reflections. For the first time in history, humanity mistook its light for the light of the world. And still, there were those who remembered, nomads who refused the walls of cities, monks who climbed mountains to speak with silence, wanderers who followed stars instead of kings. They carried stories, quiet, luminous things, like embers smuggled through the dark. Stories that said the fire is not ours to own, but the world was too loud now, too proud, too hungry for more. Empires rose, and when they did, the rivers turned red again, not with ash this time, but with blood. The weapons of bronze and iron sang their terrible songs. Cities consumed cities. People enslaved one another in the name of progress, as if forgetting that survival had once meant cooperation, not conquest. The hands that once painted on cave walls now built walls to keep others out. The fire that once brought warmth now turned fields to ruin. The same gift that had saved humanity from extinction was now teaching it how to destroy. That was the price of light. It revealed everything, even the darkness within ourselves. And yet, through the ruin, beauty persisted. The same empires that waged war also built wonders. The pyramids caught the morning sun like mirrors of eternity. The ziggurats of the east rose like steps back to heaven. The temples of stone and gold glowed under the same stars their ancestors once feared. It was as if humanity was still trying to reach the divine, but with towers instead of prayers. Each monument said, "Look what we have made." But beneath their feet, the earth whispered softly, "Yes. But look what you have forgotten." The forests retreated, the deserts advanced, rivers changed their course, the air grew heavy with the taste of smoke and metal. The planet was not angry, only weary. It had seen such ambition before in the fires of its own creation. But this time the fire came not from its core, but from the hearts of the creatures who once knelt in awe before it. And it wondered, had it breathed too much life into them? Or just enough to test its own endurance? Then came the silence between ages, a long pause like the breath drawn before a storm. The empires, proud and invincible, began to crumble under their own weight. The gods they built failed to answer, the harvests failed, the people wandered again. History, like ice, began to melt and reform. What had been stone returned to dust, what had been dust became story. And the fire, though dimmed, never went out. It passed from hand to hand, from ruin to ruin, until it found new shapes to burn within. Somewhere in the remnants of those fallen worlds, a poet sat beside a dying ember and wrote the first line of what would become the oldest prayer. We remember the light, but we are made of its shadow. That was the moment humanity began to see itself. Not as conqueror, not as victim, but as mirror. The fire outside had built empires. The fire inside would build conscience. And so, the age of myth began to give way to the age of reflection, when the human mind turned its gaze inward and found within itself both heaven and hell. It is strange to think that in every act of cruelty there was still love, that in every war there was still art, that in every ruin there was still hope, because that is what it means to be the child of both fire and dust, to destroy and yet to dream of creation. The shadow of light is not evil. It is awareness. It is the understanding that every brilliance casts a cost, that even the sun must set. The earth has always known this. It lives in cycles, burning, freezing, breaking, healing. And now humanity had become part of that cycle, not as witness, but as cause. When the stars returned, when the smoke thinned and the night sky revealed itself again, people lifted their eyes for the first time in generations. And what they saw was not the gods they once believed in, but the vastness that had birthed them. Cold, silent, endless. And yet, within that silence they felt something stir, a recognition. The same force that forged the stars was alive in their own hands, in their own minds. They had become both creator and consequence. The shadow of light had finally revealed its truth, that to create is also to destroy, and to understand is to be responsible. But few were ready to bear that knowledge. And so the earth waited again, knowing that, sooner or later, the fire it had kindled would either illuminate the cosmos or consume itself trying. Night returns. Not the fearful darkness of the old winters, but a gentler one, vast, velvet, filled with light that comes from far, far away. Humanity, for the first time in its long history, begins to look upward, not in fear, but in wonder. They have built cities, they have built stories, they have built fire into everything they touch. And now, they lift that fire to the sky, as torches, as prayers, as questions. The earth turns slowly beneath their feet, and above them the stars burn, each one a whisper from the beginning of time. In those distant lights, the first astronomers saw patterns, hunters, lions, serpents, rivers of stars. They gave them names, and in naming them they gave meaning to the void. They did not yet know that the same dust that made the stars also lived in their blood. That every atom in their breath was once part of a burning sun. But somehow they felt it. They could not explain the feeling, only that when they looked at the stars, something inside them remembered. A memory too old for words, too vast for thought. The memory of ice, the memory of fire, the memory of having survived both. The stars became their teachers. They learned to measure the seasons by their movement, to navigate the oceans by their position. They realized the heavens followed patterns. Beautiful, predictable, divine, and from that revelation a new faith was born, not in gods who ruled the earth, but in order itself, in the quiet intelligence that seemed to breathe behind everything. Some called it cosmos, some called it truth, some simply called it home. As the centuries unfolded, humans began to dream of the stars not as symbols, but as destinations. Their eyes, once filled only with the fear of extinction, now held a different hunger, to understand, to reach, to see what lay beyond the horizon of light. From caves to cities, from fires to telescopes, from chants to equations, it was all the same story, retold in new languages. The story of a creature that had looked at its own reflection in the water, and then at the reflection of the universe in the night sky. The same awe, the same question, the same silence that waited for an answer. And yet, as they looked farther outward, they also began to look farther inward. The thinkers of Greece, of India, of the deserts of Arabia spoke of atoms and souls, of infinity and nothingness, of light and shadow. They began to realize that the smallest and the largest things in existence were bound by the same rules, that the movement of stars mirrored the rhythm of the heart, that the spiral of galaxies echoed the shape of a seashell, that the pulse of life was a faint reflection of the pulse of the universe itself. The boundary between heaven and earth began to blur. And yet, the earth did not let them forget. The glaciers that had once covered half the planet still slept beneath the poles. Deep within their frozen layers, the planet's memories remained. Air from ancient centuries, ashes from forgotten fires, traces of storms that had shaped history before history existed. If the stars were the future, the ice was the past. Both silent, both patient, both telling the same truth, that time is not a line, but a circle, and that every beginning is only a return. When humans first cut into the ice to study it, they found bubbles of air trapped for tens of thousands of years. Inside them was the breath of a world that no longer existed. The very air of the first survivors, the last whispers of mammoths, the ghost of the winter that had nearly ended everything. It was as if the planet itself had written a diary and hidden it in crystal pages. And when we read it, we found our own story inside. We found that the earth had never forgotten us. It had been waiting, quietly, for us to remember it. As civilizations rose and fell, the stars remained. They watched, indifferent yet intimate, as we burned forests and built cathedrals, as we prayed and despaired, as we launched fire into the heavens and called it progress. Every spark from every forge, every torch, every candle was only a reflection of them, of the light that had been shining long before we learned to see. And perhaps the stars, in their distant patience, understood us. Perhaps they saw in us what the earth once saw, its memory, walking. One night, under the sky of the new age, a solitary figure stood on a hill, a philosopher, or perhaps a child, it doesn't matter. They looked up, and for a moment, the boundary between the self and the cosmos dissolved. In that instant, they understood, not with the mind, but with the silence of recognition, that everything that ever was still exists somewhere, in light. The stars are not above us, they are within us. The same fire that once tore open the crust of the earth at Toba, the same heat that nearly ended the story of our species, still burns behind our eyes. We are the continuation of that fire, gentler now, but just as fierce in its longing to know. And maybe that is the secret of the stars, that they are not destinations at all, but reminders. Reminders that the earth is not alone, that creation is not finished, that every spark, no matter how small, is part of something eternal. The glaciers remember where we came from. The stars remind us where we are going. Between them lies the fragile miracle of now, this heartbeat, this breath, this human moment, on a planet that still glows faintly with the memory of its own beginning. Some say the universe is silent, but perhaps it isn't. Perhaps everything we call silence is simply the sound of the cosmos listening back. The story begins, and always begins, with fire. Not the fire of comfort, but the fire of ending. Every era that came before us ended the same way. A shudder in the earth, a long winter, a silence. And yet from each silence, life found a way to speak again. Now here we are, the descendants of everything that refused to vanish. We, the children of catastrophe. If you listen closely, beneath the noise of cities and engines, beneath the hum of our machines and our endless conversations, you can still hear it. The low heartbeat of a planet that has died and been reborn 1,000 times. It is patient. It is older than memory, and it remembers everything. It remembers the great ice that covered half the world. It remembers the volcano that darkened the skies. It remembers the tiny bands of survivors who carried fire across the cold, their breath freezing in the wind, their hearts stubbornly alive. The earth remembers them, and through that memory, we exist. We live now in an age brighter than any before. Our fires burn higher, our voices reach farther. We have mapped the mountains and measured the stars. We have learned to split the atom, to rewrite the code of life, to pierce the heavens themselves. We walk on the moon. We look toward Mars. We speak to machines made in our own image. But behind every invention, every brilliant act of creation, the same old question hides in the flame. What happens when the fire burns too bright? The glaciers retreat again, the seas rise, the forests fall. The planet grows warm and restless, as if remembering its own fever. We tell ourselves that this time will be different, that this time we can control the storm. But perhaps the earth is not asking for control. Perhaps it is asking for humility. For every era that forgets its place is eventually reminded. The first humans looked up and saw the stars. We look up now and see satellites. But the feeling, that ache, that wonder, is the same. We are still searching for home, even while standing upon it. And maybe that is the tragedy and the beauty of our kind, that we are always building, always reaching, always forgetting, and then remembering again. We are the echo of everything that has survived destruction, the living proof that even catastrophe can be creative. From the ashes of Toba, our ancestors carried forward a single truth, that fragility is not weakness, and that survival is an act of imagination. From the ruins of ice, we learn to shape tools, to build, to hope. From the darkness of volcanic night, we learn to light our own stars. And from every near ending, we learned how to begin again. That is what it means to be human. To stand at the edge of extinction and whisper, "Not yet." We like to believe we are different from the ones who came before, that we have transcended the old fears. But we are still the same creatures who once huddled in caves and watched the sky collapse. The difference is that now the fire we hold is larger. And the question is no longer will we survive the cold, but can we survive ourselves? Because the greatest catastrophe may not come from the earth this time. It may come from within, from the same flame that once saved us. The flame of thought, of invention, of power. Still, I choose to believe in the better ending, the one the earth itself seems to prefer. After every storm, it begins again. After every collapse, it rebuilds. And after every silence, there is a sound, faint at first but growing, the sound of life returning. We are that sound now, the whisper of a planet remembering how to dream. When we reach for the stars, perhaps it is not escape we seek, but reunion with the same light that once gave birth to us. Because the truth is simple, and it has been true since the first ember glowed in the first cave. The universe is not something we look at. It is something we belong to. We are made of the same fire, the same dust, the same impossible will to exist against all odds. We are not just survivors of catastrophe. We are its children, its continuation, its song. And perhaps one day, long after we are gone, when another world begins its own long winter, the wind will carry whispers of us, our machines, our bones, our stories across the darkness. And somewhere in the silence between stars, another voice will rise and say, "They were here once, they lived, they built fire from ash, and they loved this world enough to remember it." That is all any species can hope for, to be remembered not for how it ended, but for how it endured. We, the children of catastrophe, the children of dust and flame, carry the memory of the earth in our blood. And as long as we keep wondering, keep creating, keep lighting small fires against the dark, our story will never truly end. Because the earth did not destroy us, it made us, and through us, it still remembers how to dream. The Children of Catastrophe concludes this journey through Earth's deepest memories, from the fire that nearly erased us to the light that made us human. This final chapter asks, after every storm, what remains? The answer is simple: us. We are the memory of the planet, the echo of every extinction and every rebirth. Listen slowly. Breathe with the story. And if it moves something in you, let it. Stay curious, stay gentle, stay alive to the wonder.